It's not calling you Josh Frydenberg, it's calling you Dosh Frydenberg.
Under the Coalition, taxes for hard-working Australians will always be lower.
You know, I don't hold a hose, mate, and I don't sit in the control room.
They're answers that only can come from Victoria, I'm afraid, because that's not my job.
But I ain't spending any time, though, because in the meantime, every 3 months, a person was torn to pieces by a crocodile in North Queensland.
G'day and welcome to Hard Hats and High Vis Week 8. That means the election is over and Hong Kong Jack and Jack the Insider, the two Jacks, are here today to shuffle through the entrails of the federal election. But before we get started, I just want to remind listeners to give us a bit of a rap if you like. We can give ourselves a rap, but we'd like you to do it on social media. Let us know. Give us a review on your podcast app, or in fact, let us know through Twitter, where you can get hold of me. I'm Jack the Insider. I'm Jack the Insider on Twitter, or indeed at the Conditional Release Program. At gmail.com, and the Conditional Release Program at gmail.com. Drop us a line. Let us know what you think of the show, how we can improve, or whether you just hate our guts and want to give us a kicking. G'day, Jack. How are you? It's Hong Kong Jack. How are you, mate? How are things in Hong Kong? Very grey here in Sydney.
Yeah, pretty grey here as well.
Oh, there you go. So, grey days. But look, let me ask you the question. Would it be rude to say that Anthony Albanese would only ever be the smartest man in the room if he was sitting there on his own?
In the car seat, you mean?
well, it doesn't have to be that small a room. But I mean, if he was just sitting there on his own, he'd be the smartest man in the room. But is that a problem, Jack? Not being the smartest man in the room?
I don't think it is. You know, we've tried the smartest man in the room tactic just recently.
The technocrats, yeah.
And it didn't go that well. Can I just go to Bill Clinton for his opinion of Prime Minister Kevin Rudd?
Oh.
When he was newly Prime Minister. This is Bill Clinton. In my opinion, he is one of the most well-informed, well-read, intelligent leaders in the world today. You could just see Kevin preening at that, couldn't you?
Careful now. He is litigious.
He is litigious. Bill Clinton again. He told me he really didn't know much about America. Like most Australian politicians who know more about America than they do about Australia. That's what he told me Sunday when we were talking. He then proceeded to describe in excruciating detail George Washington's strategy to hold New York in the Revolutionary War. And I have to like the use of the term excruciating. It'd be like having Bob Carr explain something to you.
Civil War. Bob Carr on the Civil War.
Yeah.
American Civil War. Oh, he is that is basically his topic. Don't start Bob Carr on the American Civil War. You'll be literally gone for hours.
Make sure you got a comfy chair.
So it's not an insult to say someone is not the smartest man in the room because there are other skills as a politician that Albo has.
No, when Julia Gillard took over, she said, I never wanted to foster the culture that says once the leader has spoken, then everyone must defer. I don't think you prove leadership by sitting out each and every moment to kind of prove you're the smartest person in the room. It's just not the way to run a government. I'm sure Bob Hawke always thought he was the smartest man in the room because his narcissism knew no bounds. But he was a clever enough politician to realise that that's not the way you run a government, that you actually empower your ministers
back in the day,
you form a consensus.
Back in the Hawke day, yes, of course. But back in the Hawke day, you had Barry Jones, and he is the smartest man in any room you'd ever walk into.
Terrible politician, but a very, very smart man.
So being smart is not the politician's key skill. It's the ability to negotiate, to win consensus through the arguments of others.
That's right. Yeah, and to take people with you. The role of leadership is to take people with you. It doesn't mean you've got to bully them and terrify them because they're too frightened to disagree with you. That's no way to lead. And everything about Albo that we've seen so far is promising him to be a really good Prime Minister.
Yeah, I thought it started on the night on his victory speech. Because there were at the Canterbury Hurlston RSL there that night. Quite a few friends of mine and probably yours too, Jack, were there, and some of them, well, a pocket of that crowd was involved in a bit of triumphalism and a bit of hubris. But Albo jumped on that straight away. You know, you very rarely see it in a victory speech, but he said, hey, that's enough of that, you know. Be quiet and listen to me.
Yeah, and as soon as Tanya Plibersek went a little bit off-piste with the sledging of Peter Dutton, he jumped on that as well?
Yeah, look, yes, he did. He did. I'm sure there would have been a phone call. And it's probably true that Tanya may have felt a little miffed that she wasn't part of the Gang of Five.
Yeah,
the first round of ministers sworn in.
Yeah.
She is the education, or will be the education minister, and they're due to be sworn in this week.
And she's a former deputy leader and all that sort of stuff. So.
Yes, so she might have thought, well, no, look, I mean, I think we'll talk about how the new Labor government approaches its opposition, but the best thing to do in these cases is basically pretend that they don't exist. Isn't that right? Oh, yeah. Or if you're pushed on their existence, oh, yeah, well, you know, they're sorting themselves out, you know. That sort of thing.
Well, you know, they've got their challenges in front of them. That's what you say.
Yeah, that's about it, isn't it? Rather than kick a few heads, plenty of time for that. But yes, after the victory speech, Albo went of course to Tokyo for the Quad meeting. That was a stunning success. You know, he was 2 days out from being elected, and all of a sudden he's being deified by Joe Biden. And a hearty welcome and congratulations from Modi and the Japanese Prime Minister. So it was a really good start. There was a congratulatory note from the Chinese government, from the Chinese Premier, which he sort of swatted away, which was great, I think, because the talk was tough, but it was also had meaning that it said, look, you know, we'll regard rapprochement as having occurred when you drop the trade sanctions. And that's just how you spell it out to China, isn't it? You know, this is our position.
Yeah, straight talk works.
Yeah. So, South Pacific, Penny Wong's doing, or has completed now, a whistle stop of the South Pacific, including a tour of Fiji, and this coincides with the Chinese Premier again, who's now doing a hearts and minds visit of the South Pacific. So Australia has its work cut out there, doesn't it?
It does. You'd have to wonder why no one was up in the South Pacific immediately following the Solomon Islands announcement, wouldn't you?
It was just actually astonishing. The Pacific Minister then was Zed Cezelia, known widely in the DFAT community as the Z Team, Jack.
Well, he was the junior senator from Canberra, I think, wasn't he, from the ACT. It puzzles me that Maurice Payne, who was then the foreign minister, wasn't up there rather than the Z Team.
Yes, I mean, for Australia, it seems that, we should be spending a lot more time in the Pacific than we are in Europe, for example. Because there are great challenges on there now. But most of all, I think there was a perception, there has been a perception around South Pacific nations that they were treated as a bit of a joke by governments, not just the one immediately past, but by governments generally over a fair stretch of time.
Yep, I think that's right. That's been an error.
And we talked about cabinet government, Jack. What does that really mean? Tell me what that means.
Just before we get to the end, we're talking about the good things that the government's got off to a start. Huh? They've also dusted off that tried and true technique of saying, good Lord, we've got in here and opened up the filing cabinet and had a look. It's much, much worse than we thought it was going to be.
We've had a look at the profit and loss statement.
Yeah,
we've opened up the books,
yeah,
and we've had a bit of a squiz around, and things are crook in Tallarook, Jack.
Yeah, and can you remember Peter Costello doing this in 1996? You know, he was on the telly for about 3 weeks saying, "My good, couldn't believe how
Couldn't
bad
believe,
things are."
yeah.
Yeah,
Stuff that was left, IOUs,
yeah, yeah,
money missing and
yeah.
all that
It's
sort of stuff.
terrible.
Someone's
You
had
know?
their hand in the till, that
Yeah,
sort of
yeah,
thing. Yeah.
yeah. There's no biscuits in the tea room. It's just terrible, you know.
Jim Chalmers has led that, as has Katie Gallagher, the finance minister, have led that attack, and it is a common thing. It's a common thing for good governments to do
It
when
is.
they come in, isn't it?
It is.
You know, it's not.
Yeah.
We might remember 2007. You mentioned Costello coming in '96, but we might remember 2007, and under Kevin, it was hands across the divide, and let's see if we can't find a job for some of you retiring Liberals, and that sort of thing. It was kid glove treatment. You know, it's not about giving him a kick, but at least you've got to say you wouldn't believe how crook things are now that we've had a good look at them.
Yeah, no, so that's an excellent start. The other thing is, I think Linda Burney might be a listener to the Two Jacks.
We did see a little bit of evidence of that there, Jack. We talked about this in Hard Hats and High Vis the previous week, how the Uluru statement could be prosecuted. And to be fair to Linda, she may well have been listening, but to be fair to the yet to be sworn in Minister for Indigenous Affairs, these are fairly sensible. You know, what we suggested was fairly sensible, that you take your time, that you prosecute this across the community, you deal with people that you might not especially enjoy dealing with, but you win the argument slowly.
Anyway, she's off on a really good start with that. The temptation is, when you've been out of government for a bit and you've got something important like the Uluru statement to do, that you jump in there and say, look, let's get this through tomorrow. You know, It's just the wrong approach. You know,
sorry, go on.
But everything about this government suggests that they understand that they're going to have to take the community with them while they proceed. So that's an excellent start.
Well, yes, and just as a reminder, we on the Two Jacks, Hard Hats and High Vis, were talking about Mabo and how Keating was able to persuade all the stakeholders how to progress on it, even the ones he didn't like talking to, including the Victorian Premier at the time, Jeff Kennett, and Linda Burney also cited that as a way to approach it. So yes, you may well have been listening to us there, Jack.
And I think she gets it, that the biggest danger to Uluru statement is the Greens.
Well, yeah, that was a statement made by the new member for Lingyari, Marion Scrismore. I think that's how it's pronounced. And yeah, she made that point too. It's a very sensible one. And in fact, it was, as we discussed, the problem with the Mabo legislation. There are a couple of WA Greens there who thought, well, we don't think this will be fair on Aboriginal people, but not that we've met any. But we're going to vote it down, and they walked that one back after Paul Keating came into their offices and had a very strong word in their feel likes.
Had a quiet little chat to them.
So there you go. Look, the Uluru statement is so important. It's important in that it changes the way the nation feels about itself. That's why it's a really big thing, and really big things like this can't be progressed just by sheer will or sheer desire to get it over. It's something that requires the great political skills of winning people over in argument.
And that takes as long as it takes is the answer to that.
Yeah. Look, we did just go on. I just want to touch on cabinet government, how it should work, Jack. You tell me. You tell our listeners how cabinet government should work. The Prime Minister's he's got the big chair in the middle, right? Yep. And then we've got a cabinet of probably 22 ministers, somewhere of that order, around the table, and they'll have outer ministries. They'll yet to be determined. What should take place in a cabinet meeting?
whenever a minister wants to put something up, it goes on the agenda, and the minister's got to go in there and argue their case, and they argue it out until they reach some kind of consensus, and ultimately it goes to a vote. So
Yes.
it's not decided by 4 people in the Prime Minister's office before they go in. It's decided actually in the cabinet room.
And that's
The
pretty
best-
much what's been going on, hasn't it, in the past?
Well, that's what
the
goes on
previous
in
government.
good governments, but it isn't what's been
I
happening.
know. I mean, if we look at the Morrison government, you almost had a gang of 4 there who would basically determine the progress of any legislation or any particular government matter. I know that there were issues in regard to the pandemic that basically did reduce it to a cabinet exercise involving the state and territory ministers. State premiers and territory chief ministers. But in terms of a cabinet at the Australian federal government level, it seemed to me that 3 or 4 people were running it, and everyone would just be told, was just presented to them as a fait accompli.
And that's indeed what happened in the first Rudd government. The
Yeah,
Gang
well,
of
we
Four
did actually have the gang of 4, didn't we?
doing that, and that wasn't a success. I've got to say, the best government we've had in my lifetime was I think the Hawke government, and they went a step further. They actually improved the situation by reshaping the public service. So they had a smaller cabinet, and each cabinet minister, each big government department had a cabinet minister in charge of it, right? And then had junior ministers looking after parts of that department, but not the whole. So at the cabinet table was someone responsible for every department of state. And that worked exceptionally well. Of course, it was helped because of the talent in the Hawke government, but that, I think, is the best way to go about it. So what the government's got to do now is, firstly, the caucus will, they've gone back to the Rudd's silly idea of him appointing the ministers, deciding who's going to be a minister. The caucus
So
will elect.
the caucus will determine who's in the cabinet.
We'll
what ministries
determine the
that they will
ministry. The caucus will elect the ministry, and then the Prime Minister will decide who's a cabinet minister and who's in the outer ministry, and allocate the portfolios. But at the same time, they need to shape the public service. So you work out.
We'll get to that.
We'll
get to that in a minute, because that's really a very difficult thing, and we'll talk about the issues that arise from that in a little while. So Anthony Albanese listens to his caucus, who say, we want these people in ministries.
Yep.
And it is Anthony Albanese's job as Prime Minister to say, I want these people in my cabinet and these people in the outer ministry, and I want these people in fixed jobs. And
But he's going to have to talk to the caucus, or to the key people in the caucus, while he does that.
Right.
Because there are factional considerations, there are geographic considerations. Even if your best 20 people were in Victoria, you wouldn't have an all Victorian cabinet. You've got to share that around geographically as well as amongst the factions.
Well, you would think on the election performance you'd have half a dozen from Western Australia, Jack.
Could be.
Well, there might be, but I mean, but what I'm saying is, it's not about representation, but it is about having national representation.
That's
so
right.
You've
Yes.
got ministers everywhere. Look, just as an aside, what do you think of these community cabinet meetings? They're junk ideas, aren't they?
Terrible idea. Don't see any point in them at all.
Just really silly, and it's the idea. I guess. Look, I sort of understand the legitimacy of it. You go to a town hall. It's all ticketed, so people can be declined a ticket, but generally people in the local community can go and basically interview, I suppose, the cabinet around the country. It was just an odd thing to do.
It's confusing campaigning with governing.
Yeah, okay. I mean, this is essentially the pointy end of it. It's the executive. We vote for people to represent us in the parliament. by party, and when that party finds itself in government, they determine the shape of the executive. Isn't that right, Jack?
That's correct. And don't forget, the Westminster system has a tradition of cabinet solidarity. That is, you go into cabinet, and you can, as a minister, you can argue your case, and you can argue against somebody else's case. But the tradition is when you walk out that door, all the cabinet members agree with the decision, at least until they write their memoir.
Yes, indeed. But what you're saying is that it's basically the way to panel beat an idea in the best way. I mean, we could talk about committees looking at a horse and creating a camel, but what we're really talking about here is a cabinet comes up with, that a minister comes up with an idea, a policy, an approach, a shift in funding, etc., and once it's looked at by the body as a whole and is subject to a critique, then it becomes better through that system.
You get rid of the sillier ideas
straight away.
For instance, a national broadband network, as first proposed, wouldn't have made it through a proper cabinet process. That was designed That was designed on the back of a coaster in an aeroplane between Stephen Conroy and Kevin Rudd.
Look, there's much to like about it, but there was nothing really behind it. The things that I liked about it were that it opened up regional Australia, and now regional Australia has got shitty broadband.
How much money could we have saved if they just run one cable to your office at home?
That's not it, Jack. I'm talking about information rich, information poor people, and it shouldn't be defined by postcode or geographic location. That's the issue. What we've got here is, the previous government has actually acknowledged the failings of it and is now looking to upgrade fibre to the home in as many homes as possible, particularly in regional Australia. So they understood the issue around it.
But it just would have gotten off to a better start if it had gone through a proper cabinet process.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you. This idea of writing things down on the back of beer coasters is probably not the right way to govern, Jack. But we've got as you mentioned before, there's an issue with the public service, isn't it? Now, should we have a night of the long knives? Should we just send many of them packing and make new appointments?
Well, I think any government's entitled to have public service who they are confident will work with them to provide good government to Australia.
Did the previous government or the public service around the previous government become politicised?
Oh, I think that's been an increasing thing, not just in the previous government, since the Whitlam era.
So there is a case for, well, certainly I saw some sort of Twitter flurrying about the PMO. Surely everyone in the PMO should be gone, as of last week.
I'm happy to leave that to the incoming government to decide, and they can make. And if they're sensible, I don't think a wholesale removal of people is a good idea. You look at the people who you think you can work with, and find some others to replace the ones you can't work with.
I suppose, the downside to the night of the long knives is that there are only a few people in the country who can do these things, aren't there? Yeah. I mean, it's not as if we're talking about, we just pull someone out of a shopping mall and say, "Would you like to be head of the Prime Minister's office?"
No, it's a peculiar skill set.
Yeah, it is. I mean, even people from corporate backgrounds would struggle with the dimension of that sort of appointment.
It's quite a different job. Yeah.
What do you reckon would happen to the head of? I think it's called Home Affairs now, Jack Pizzolo, isn't it? What would happen to him?
Well, firstly, you want to look at whether you want to have a Department of Home Affairs, whether you want to have that big super department.
Oh, God, what are you going to disentangle it now, Jack? It was a bugger of a thing putting it together.
I think an incoming government should be free at some stage to say whether they think that's a good idea. And there's some things they could get rid of. They can get rid of those black uniforms for starters.
We got a lot of medals. They have handed out a lot of medals to the border force. I mean, it's
Yeah.
just all a bit ridiculous. But I would think Labor would go. Just my sense of it, that Labor would tread very, very quietly over immigration.
Yeah, I think that's probably right. I mean, immigration about immigration matters in Australia, there's a large degree of consensus. It's
Yes.
one of the reasons why Australia has the most popular and successful immigration program in the Western world.
But in refugee policy, I did notice after the boat turned back, the Sri Lankan boat, which it's a bit messy in itself in terms of how that was politicised on election day, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But yes, the Greens and others were saying that this was deplorable from Labor. It's like June 2010 never happened, when there were, we were on Guinness Book of Records rates for boat arrivals in this country, and there was really a sense, and you know me, Jack, I'm perhaps a reformed open border guy, but there was a real sense that the government had lost control of immigration.
There has never been a consensus for open borders in Australia, and I think there never will be. There are a noisy minority who think that's what we should do, but that is never popular. It's no way to get elected to government.
Yeah, so we'll see over the coming.
And Prime Minister Albanese and other ministers seem to recognise that.
So would you expect to see these public service announcements, the hirings and the firings, occur over the next, what period? Next week or so, next month or so?
It could take a little bit longer, but yeah, over the next short while, yeah.
We are still waiting for ministers to be sworn in. In fact, the announcement of
Or
various
to be
portfolios.
elected, for that matter.
So that's one part of the process, and then we get down to govern, and then they get down to govern. Anthony Albanese is Prime Minister. What are the sorts of pitfalls they need to avoid?
Oh, the first one is already done. I have it's a pet peeve of mine. I really don't like it when Prime Ministers talk about my government.
Oh yeah. Oh, that's awful.
John Howard did it. John Howard did it for months after he got elected in 1996, and every time I think I was setting new world records for swearing at the television. I must check with my wife whether she sent that off to the Guinness Book of Records. But every time the "my government" thing came up, there would be expletive after expletive. But
So
I just don't like
Albanese,
it. It's not your government, Anthony. It's our government.
the government that I lead, because that was a comment.
It's marginally better, but
It's
yeah.
not much better, is it? Because that is a bit of an Albanese favourite, or was during the campaign.
It's
Under
the government.
that I lead.
Yeah.
It's the government, isn't it?
Yeah. Or our government, if you like. But, it's not my
mine.
government.
Yeah. No, I see what you mean there. Okay, so the government, our government. All right, what's next?
I suppose there's plenty.
How much consultation should there be with the crossbench?
Well, a fair bit. I mean, and there should be a fair bit of consultation generally in the community, is my view of, if you want to make change, you've got to carry people with you to a large extent.
So what does Labor do about, let's put the Greens aside for one moment, about the Teal independents, for example? Do they appoint someone almost like a whip, just to keep them informed, sit them down, have a cup of tea, take them out to lunch, that sort of thing?
Well, that's generally the job of the Leader of the House, which is not it has no constitutional or legislative basis to be Leader of the House. I can't remember. I think it dates back to the 1950s. Menzies appointed the first one. And I think these days they get extra pay, so they get paid more than their cabinet colleagues for being Leader of the House. But the job really revolves around reporting to the Prime Minister and keeping control of the parliamentary processes, which also means making sure you know where the votes are, and that means you and probably a couple of other people have got to keep talking to the Teals all the time.
And that would be Tony Burke, wouldn't it? That Tony Burke would have that job.
Almost certainly be Tony Burke. He was doing a good job as leader of the House, and as leader of the opposition, as parliamentary leader of the House.
Yes.
So he'll be good.
Yes, well, he was up against Peter Dutton, and who was the leader of the House on the floor and in the chamber, and now
Albo himself had been leader of the House in the previous government.
Yes, he had,
and Christopher Pyne did a good job as leader of the House for the under Abbott and Turnbull, I think.
I think when Morrison became Prime Minister, that job was, well, Pyne did not get that job, and it went to, I'm just trying to think, I think it went to Christian Porter, and then when he had his travails, it was sent off to Dutton. So Burke, I would think, almost certainly will take that role. And I just mentioned Dutton.
He's not as annoying as Christopher Pyne, but I'm sure he could work on that. Yeah.
Oh, look, Christopher Pyne's actually quite an amusing fellow, an entertaining fellow in person, and I know people find that very difficult to believe, but he actually is quite a pleasant person to meet. Not for everyone, of course, Jack, as we know, but
well, there often is that disconnect between politicians' media persona and their personal persona. I can recall this coming up. A very successful corporate chap from Australia was coming through Hong Kong when Julia Gillard was Prime Minister. He's on his way across to Doha, and a mutual friend arranged that we would meet up and have lunch. And this bloke had been having quite a lot of dealings with the government, with Julia as the new Prime Minister. And he sat down over lunch and said, look, I've sat next to her in meetings a few times, and she's warm, funny, engaging, absolutely across her brief, and just so good to deal with. And he said, is that the real Julia? And I said, well, I've known her since 1985, and that's absolutely who she is. And she says, why don't I see that which is on the telly?
There is that disconnect sometimes, isn't there? And the reverse is probably true with the potentially litigious Kevin Rudd. That everyone thought he was terrific until you got to sit next to him. So,
nobody who knew him thought that.
So if you had to sit next to him in a couple of meetings, it might be, what do we say? It might not be all that comfortable for everyone involved. And we just say that bearing in mind that Kevin Rudd is potentially litigious in this day and age. So, so we'll move on to the Parliament and how that might work shortly. But clearly, Burke and others will have to cuddle up to the Greens as well, particularly in the Senate, because they know that they won't be able to get legislation through without the thumbs up from the Greens and the Jackie Lambie network. That seems to be the consistent route, the pathway.
I'm not sure cuddle's the right word for the Greens. It's a bit like cuddling a porcupine,
Yeah, that's the thing. They have to drop. They have to drop the hubris that they showed in 2010. They say they've learned. We'll see. Yeah. We'll see. I mean, we did talk a week or so ago about the National Party cart leading the Liberal Party horse and how disastrous that was, and Labor really can't be seen to be dragged around by the Greens this time. And the Greens have this view, of course, as we know, that if they can't achieve perfection in their eyes, they'll just shut the whole thing down.
Yeah, the pursuit of the perfection is the enemy of the good.
Yeah, that's right. And it's sort of an apolitical view of the world. My way or the highway is not how politics is supposed to work. Politics is about finding the possible, the art of finding the possible, Jack.
Well, I spent a lot of years in the socialist left of the Victorian Labor Party, and the Greens are effectively about 40 or 50% of the old socialist left. And the tomato left, they were known as in those days, and they are exactly the same people, and they have exactly the same approach. They would rather die in the ditch and have no improvement whatsoever rather than accept any compromise.
Yeah, we'll see if they've learned. They say they have, and really with the kind of representation, we did notice, unfortunately, that the Madonna
At least
Jarrett,
this time there'll be no marriage ceremony with the Greens.
yeah, that was ugly. But we do know now that Madonna Jarrett, a friend of yours, Jack, has unfortunately gone down in Brisbane, and the Greens kitty has won that. The only good thing I'd say about that is I did have a few bob on him. And did recommend to my readers that in the Australian that they do the same. So if they did, they'd be, I think, about 8-1 better off. Excuse me. Let's get on just with a bit of a review of the federal election. There's been some terrible bloody nonsense written by the commentariat about what the Liberal Party must do now, Jack. What should they do? Or should they just, jump in their cars and drive to cliffs and head over? I mean, this nonsense that they should become more right-wing, what does that mean exactly?
Well, I'm just puzzled that Twitter is full of all of these Labor and Greens people who seem to be filling their entire day with telling the Liberal Party what they should do. I can't work out why they care.
Yeah, well, Labor and the Greens at a sort of parliamentary MHR or Senate level, they should be ignoring them and leaving them to their pain because they've got a lot. But the thing I want to talk to you about was this view that's been put about in the commentariat by conservative commentators saying the Liberal Party needed to shift to the right, that they needed to basically, they can't win. It's almost to put the white flag up in the inner cities. We can't compete there. What we need is a new right-wing model. But I just don't even that will appeal to the suburbs and the regions. But I just don't understand what that means. What would that mean in practical terms? Would it mean that they want a reduction in immigration? Would they want to go down the sort of one nation route? I don't get it.
Well, what you've got to do when you lose an election is, well, for starters, don't do what Labor did in 1996, which was they couldn't work out why they lost it all. The first thing you've got to work out is why did we lose?
Yeah. Well, there is a review underway that's been led by Jane Hume and Senator Jane Hume, and she is working with Brian Loughnan. Should that, regardless of the legitimacy or otherwise of that review, should that be made available? Should that be made public?
No, that's a matter for the party.
But should it be made available to the rank and file?
Probably not, because otherwise you won't get the frankness in response to the people you talk to. But the first thing you've got to work out is what went wrong, and what went wrong is relatively straightforward. The Morrison government was a government, the Liberal government generally, was a government that had run out of steam. Can
I offer a theory, Jack, that in 2019 they didn't expect to win?
That's probably right.
And when they woke up on the Sunday morning after the 2019 election, they said, what the bloody hell are we going to do now?
Yeah, and what they did after 2019 was keep on campaigning rather than governing. So they lost their approach, which is to be a competent government. They stopped doing that and started to be a political campaign machine all the time.
Is that Morrison's go, though? I mean,
that's Morrison's
leadership
go,
under Scott Morrison? This perpetual campaign government through the prism of election campaigning, that basically you never want to upset anybody and you want to pick up friends along the way. It's not a good way to run a government, is it?
It's a terribly poor way to run things. The other thing, of course, is in 2019, people didn't know Morrison all that well, and they were prepared to say, well, he's better. We think he's better than Bill Shorten, and that's not a very high bar to jump over, in my view.
In your view, Well, I mean, that should have been the Labor review of the loss of the unlosable in 2019. It would have been a fairly short review. Bill Shorten.
Yes, that's right.
Just the two words.
Yeah, Bill Shorten and too many promises, too many big ticket item promises was the reason they lost in 2019.
They knocked them off one by one.
They did. Now, this what should happen now with the Liberal Party is should work out. Well, okay, what happened was we were a government that's run its steam. What a Barnaby put it in very country Australian.
The curtains.
People need to change their curtains. That's probably
sometimes you don't need to change the curtains, but they'll change the curtains anyway.
Yeah. So there's an element of truth that all the way along we've thought that the government had run out of steam. Right? Yeah. The other thing was people had gotten to know Morrison better this time.
Yeah, that's right.
And by God, they didn't like what they saw.
Didn't really care too much about it. It wasn't quite. I mean, look, it was a baseball batting. I hate the term because, in this country we use the grey nick or the gun and more.
Yeah,
this was an English bat, but anyway,
even one from the Madras Rubber Factory. I mean, that's okay as well.
Well, they make a very nice bat, the MRF. But yes, they were waiting, and it wasn't so much an embrace of Labor, but it was let's give this mob the toweling they richly deserve.
Yeah, and in fact, there was a lack of embrace of Labor. There was an uncertainty about Labor. They just knew that in just enough numbers, they liked them better than Scott Morrison, which is not that hard. But in Western Australia, that was different. There was an embrace of Labor in Western Australia.
Tell you what, I mean, we're the last Liberal out of Western Australia. Please turn the lights off. I mean, they really have been reduced. I don't think rump is the right word. I think they've got 5 federal MPs. They've got 2 in the upper house. 2 in the lower house in Western Australia, where McGowan leads with a thumping majority of 54-5. He's basically just about wiped them out.
Yeah.
And maybe it wasn't about McGowan. Maybe it was about how Morrison and Porter and others, referring to Western Australians living in caves and all. It's just it's not a good way to speak to potential voters, Jack.
No, even if you think it's true.
Well, you don't say it. You don't say it. I mean, and Labor, as I read these things, Labor had basically just absorbed all of that and went, well, okay, well, now we know how to campaign. How are we going to win this campaign in Western Australia? And, they got absolutely smashed. What happens now with Scott Morrison? Surely he can't stay in the Parliament. He reckons he is.
I don't think it really matters much. If he stays in Parliament, he'll be a pest like Kevin Rudd was when he started in Parliament.
Dutton can't give him a ministry, can he?
No, he shouldn't.
Well, he shouldn't. Yeah, it is something to watch. Just exactly what role Morrison is going to have.
I don't think Dutton will.
I can't see anything else happening to Morrison other than a by-election in Cook in about 3 months' time.
Yeah, it might take longer than that, but it'll happen.
What does the Liberal Party have to do about Scott Morrison? Surely they have to put some distance between him and them going forward. They've got to make him the person who basically gave them the defeat. So he becomes really, he's got to get it's not a kicking because they'll say, oh, look, we want to thank him for his leadership in 2019, but after that he seemed to have lost his way. There needs to be some pretty harsh words said about him from within the party.
Yeah, I think you can just do that quietly. You haven't got to make a huge fuss about it. And the thing to do is not to make too much of a fuss about it, is just to move on with a new leadership and a new approach.
So you don't have to destroy the cult of the personality, Jack.
Well, I don't think there was much cult of a personality around him. He didn't have a huge amount of widespread support in the party itself, amongst the party faithful. That's why they couldn't have proper pre-selections in New South Wales, because he couldn't carry the party with him.
Well, stories are emerging now that Josh was offered the job last year, Josh Frydenberg, his treasurer, and knocked it back. that there were serious concerns about how Morrison was being perceived in the community. And then, of course,
Well, we
Morrison
now
ran.
know how he was perceived in the community.
Well, they seem to know that it was really bad, and since since then, the campaign was a presidential campaign based on Scott Morrison, which is a
Just with the wrong
disaster.
vehicle. He's just a poor vehicle to carry it. But look, it was an interesting election. The Liberals. We now know the Liberals are susceptible to losing seats where there are high levels of relatively well-off professionals. As those people become more progressive, that's a worry for the Liberals. Equally, I think it's fair to say that Labor faces some challenges in the same way. We were talking the other day about a seat that used to be called Melbourne Ports. What's it called now? McNamara?
Yes,
They'll be lucky to hold that from the Greens.
it's so complicated. It really is so complicated because you've got every vote being counted 3 times, but there's preferences running all over the place. Some of the right wing UAP type votes are preferencing the Greens and all this sort of stuff. As we said before, Madonna Jarrett went down in Brisbane on much the same sort of shift. McNamara's going to be a really tough hole for Labor, that gets them to 76. They certainly need that one. They're 75 at the moment. They certainly need that one, but it's really up in the air as to whether that will happen or not.
But there will be other seats in future elections where, depending on how Labor goes as a government, where they will face some of the same challenges that the Liberals face.
Yeah, we're going to take a bit of a look at the Teals now because I think there's been perhaps a little bit too much applause for the Teals, Jack, certainly from people on the left, Labor and Greens and what have you. So one of the things we did see was the rise of the Greens in the absence of Teals. So in places like Griffith, in places like Brisbane, in places like Ryan, which are generally speaking well-to-do suburbs, the Greens have had had wins in all 3 seats. Griffith, Kevin Rudd's old seat, and there were, of course, no Teal candidates there. Green vote very, very high, and we do have this sort of business of one seat lost to each of the LNP lost Brisbane and Ryan, and Labor have lost Griffith as a result, and that was without Teals. So what happens going forward with the Teals? What happens there? Will they run candidates in seats like Bennelong? Will they run candidates in seats like Cooper, the old Batman, Northcote and its environs? I do know, because I heard a little whisper from one of my contacts, that there will be a Teal candidate in the state election, Victorian state election, the seat of Hawthorn, which Labor picked up against the odds. Really taking that, a blue ribbon Liberal seat, taking that off them. So this is first. I guess the first thing to notice about this is that it's not all good news for Labor.
No, it's not. No, I said they have their susceptibilities to a Teal or Teal-like campaign against them.
And those occur in elections where you've got, in electorates where you've got, I would say, high rates of tertiary education, high incomes, high asset net worth, those sorts of things that can allow people to make sort of big judgments on things like climate change without having to worry about their consequences too much.
Yes, that's correct. Yeah, I think that's right.
Yeah, so that's just a little bit of inside information that the Teals will run. I certainly believe they'll run a candidate. Their method of campaigning too, Jack, is long and loud. So they will begin campaigning for the Victorian state election within a month or so. So that's the news from this one, that the Teals will run a candidate in the state seat of Hawthorn.
They could do quite well, I think, if they can find the right candidates in a Victorian state election, because the Liberal Party down there is a shambles.
It's a cartoon.
And equally, Labor has some vulnerabilities, I think.
Oh, yeah, there certainly are some vulnerabilities for Dan going forward, but in my view, the Liberal Party haven't got the nous to make use of them.
No, that's right. Which is why I think there's an opening for somebody else.
Yeah,
Yes.
The Greens and perhaps some other third party might make some benefit here.
Anyway, Dan might decide that monkeypox is a big worry and shut the state down for 6 months. So
that'd be a bold move. That'd be a courageous move.
Yeah. That would be a Sir Humphrey courageous move.
I did come across this too, Jack. Liberal MP, that's Victorian State Liberal MP, Tim Smith says party should forget woke elites in seats like his and go hard at the outer suburbs. I tell you what, if Tim Smith's still running around mouthing off, and Dan Andrews won't have too much to worry about, will he?
No, he's a gift that keeps giving for Dan Andrews, isn't he?
You know, please be around in November. Tim Smith, you idiot. It's hard to see blokes who are actually involved in politics, and he grew up in state politics and absolutely no sense about what they're doing. You do find it a bit, and it's kind of alarming. Yeah.
And that's a bipartisan thing, I've got to say. They have it in every party.
Now, we're just going to wrap up with a bit of a discussion about polling. Now, it's clear that polling didn't get it right in this in the federal election after getting it all wrong in 2019, and many global examples of similar shambles. What I did on a review, I saw that Newspoll both had the primary votes of the Labor and Liberal parties way too high. The Fairfax Daily, I think it's Reveal polling company, they seemed to get it closer than anybody else, but they were still out. So there are a couple of, all of them were points out of the 2-3 points away from the two-party preferred, as we understand it. Votes are still being counted, but it's about 51-49, veering into the 52-48. And the polling's got it wrong again, Jack. Is there something wrong with the methodology, or are people...
Nowhere near as spectacularly wrong as 2019, I don't think.
No, well, that was a shock.
And they'll just be saying, well, don't worry about the details. We actually got the result nearly kind of right, you know. Okay, so all the methodology was wrong, and if you look too closely at the details, we were hopeless. But don't look at that. Just say, look, we said there'd be a Labor government, you know, and there is.
Yeah, maybe they can get away with that. But when we look at approval ratings and things like that, and some people might see that as sort of junk questioning, but Scott Morrison had a negative approval rating, but he was still, I think, a point above, or might have been even money's preferred Prime Minister. And I get the feeling that when polling companies call or drop you a line on the internet or even front you in person, that people are not going to say, I really hate Scott Morrison, when they do, but they're too nice to say it. Australians are very nice people, Jack.
There's a whole lot of stuff that people get asked in all kinds of surveys where they will give the answer they think you're looking for.
Yeah, there's a heavy bias, particularly in face-to-face polling, in that regard, where you know, what would you like to hear, and I certainly think in those personal approval ratings, Morrison was well and truly underdone. Because now we know just how unpopular he has been. Not popular, you know, I mean, where his sanctuary of Queensland really didn't turn out to be a sanctuary at all. And pretty much in all other states, with the possible exception of Tasmania, he was almost universally disliked.
Yeah, that's correct. I mean, this is not specific to politics. This comes up with climate change. You ask people, should we do something about climate change? And they'll say, oh, yes, we should. And then you ask them, when they make their own choices, do they actually do anything about climate change? And the answer is no, they don't. So you look at what people do rather than what they say they think that they would like to do. And it's the same. It's the same between choosing two products. They will give you the answer that yes, I want to buy the environmentally sensitive product, but they don't. They buy the one that's good value.
Yeah, and that is that sense of, that is that sense of, we'll give you the answer that you want to hear.
Yeah.
But I honestly think that when it comes to, I mean, look, it was very clear to me in my social meanderings, Jack. You talk to people and the views on Morrison were absolutely unprintable. And certainly not the sort of language that we would use on this podcast, Jack. I just couldn't believe that he still had an approval rating worth thinking about. And it's not just the company I keep. I mean, this is sort of the general view. I don't know who's going to win, but I really dislike that Scott Morrison. I really don't like him at all.
And that was it. And that, from my reading and from my talking to people down there as well, is pretty much across the party political spectrum.
It was, yeah. That was the
as
thing.
unpopular with Liberals as he was with Labor people.
Yeah, I'm always wary of those. I voted Liberal all my life, but now I'm not going to because of Scott Morrison. You hear that. You hear that and you think, are you sure you're a Liberal voter? Are you sure you're not sneaky little Labor voter getting in there, or a Green or a Teal? But yeah, there was a strong view that Morrison. Oh, well, look, I live in an area affected by bushfires, and certainly his behaviour around that was utterly deplorable. Not only did he get it wrong by prancing off to Hawaii, and then blamed his wife for it, but then he came back and started thrusting his hands thrusting his hand in the hand of others who didn't want to have anything to do with him.
Do you remember Cyclone Tracy in Darwin?
Well, didn't Dickoff turned up though, didn't he? He flew home from Rome.
He was in Greece. He was on his first trip to Europe, and he'd taken a little side tour so he could show the press gallery around the ancient ruins in Greece. And he got back eventually, like Morrison. He did turn up back, but he was a long time getting back, and he was reluctant to come back, and that cost him a lot.
Yeah, look, it's just a no-brainer. I remember Kevin Rudd lifting suitcases, Jack, in flood-prone lands. I remember him down, and I'm not going to make any jokes about this. I do remember him after Black Saturday in Victoria, where. It just seems to me that this is one of the things that any talented politician can do properly is go along and help people with the grieving process. And when you don't do it, it just looks awful.
There's a price to pay.
Yeah. And really, it's meat and drink. I remember John Howard in Bali. It's meat and drink, and people would say to him, "Oh, thank you for coming, Mr. Howard. Thank you for coming, Prime Minister." And he said,
it's not that you do anything; it's just be there.
Yeah, it's just you've got to be there, and you've got to listen to people and talk to them. And it's just awful when they don't do those sorts of things. Yep. It really is just meat and drink. Really, I think that's where his problems stem from. And then, I don't hold a hose, mate. That's his political epitaph as far as.
Oh, that was tone deaf, wasn't it?
Oh, dear, oh dear. So there you go. Perhaps a bit more unpopular. In fact, I'd argue a lot more unpopular than the polls really showed. And that's a wrap for Hard Hats and High Vis Week 8. We'll be back with Week 9 to have a longer look at the Teals as well, and answer one or two of the questions that you've raised about where to for Australia now under a new government. Jack, it's been great to have you along.
We might have a Labor ministry elected by then.
Yes, we certainly will have. So we'll be going through that. We're going through the cabinet, the winners, the losers. There's always a few, and go through all of that. And of course, we'll have the shadow cabinet by then too, Jack. So
Always a few people who miss out on the job they wanted. A couple of people who need some counselling.
And
a couple turn a lie down.
Some of them will start getting in touch with political journalists, Jack.
The political journalists will be praying and hoping that happens, and their prayers will be answered, I'm sure.
Yeah, look, I think a couple of my sources are going to do okay. So that should be they might be a bit too busy to speak to me in future now. So
and one of your pals has really lucked in. He's got the great job.
What's that? Which one?
One of your pals has really lucked in. He's got a great job. Speechwriter to the Prime Minister.
Oh, yeah, well, James. Yeah, James. I did send him a congratulatory note and he replied, which is lovely. So, Jack...
Did he respond on notepaper from a five-star hotel?
No, I haven't. We haven't got that far yet. I'm mainly keeping in touch with him on his Instagram account at the moment. But no, it was a great week for James. Just a terrific bloke and richly deserved that he become the speechwriter for the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister might have one or two. Sometimes they do, but James is a very gifted writer himself, and
he'll just have to get left. You just have to get used to the fact that when he walks on an aeroplane, turn left.
He's going there. I think he'd be right with that now. No, terrific work for James, and look, he rolled the dice with his career over that, and it's good to see. Good to see the punters paid off. Jack, terrific to have you along with us, and we'll be back next week.
See you then.
See you, listeners.